Welcome to the David Moscop Show. My guest today is Mike Schreiner. He's the member of provincial parliament for Guelph and the leader of the Ontario Green Party. Welcome, Mike. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, David, pleasure to join you. I love the podcasting format, so looking forward to the conversation.
Me too, and I'm so pleased to have you because it's funny as I've been watching and following your work for years, and when there's an election and you're on the debate stage, I always say, "He's my favorite. He's my favorite." I like I like Mike on the debate stage. Always to me the most constructive, the most sensible, and the most interesting. And of course, I would say that right now, but it is true. You can ask people; it is absolutely true. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I want to start with this. We're a couple of weeks out from the legislature returning, and I'm wondering how you expect that will go in the current climate. Is it going to be collegial? Is it going to be productive? Is it going to be nasty? What are you expecting?
So I'm anticipating it's going to be a bit more collegial than the last term of the Ford government, and I think a lot of that's being driven by Donald Trump's attack on Canada, the looming existing and maybe escalating trade war, and I've made it clear publicly and personally with the premier that I'm willing to work across party lines to put Canada first, to protect Ontario workers, Ontario jobs, Ontario companies. And I've heard the same sentiment, especially from the leader of the opposition, Marit Stiles, who's the leader of the NDP. So I'm anticipating it'll be a bit more collegial, but at the same time, David, we have a lot of serious issues in Ontario that the premier needs to be held accountable on. I mean, the affordability crisis, especially housing affordability, the dire state of our healthcare system, the $1,500 per student cut we've seen to education, and just the attack on our farmland, our green spaces, our environment we've seen from the Ford government. And so I'm going to be looking to balance holding the government accountable on issues that I know are top of mind for Ontarians, while at the same time listening to Canadians about the fact that they want us to be working together across party and jurisdictional lines to push back against Trump's threats.
So people find this really interesting, this tension between parties and personalities in the legislature, where your job on the opposition benches seats is to hold the government to account. Your job is to give the government a hard time, to push, to criticize, to call out, to investigate. And yet there are moments when you need to cooperate. And parties are parties, the legislature is the legislature, but humans are humans. And I think a lot of people sometimes look and wonder how people manage those relationships, especially when they see a party attacking on one day and then cooperating the next day and say, my God, it looks like they're friends all of a sudden. I'm curious if you can sort of walk us through the process of what it's like to be at one time a critic and another time an ally, or at least cooperative.
Yeah, well, oftentimes, David, that tone is set by the premier, because obviously the government holds the most power in the legislature. And so I know in the early days of the COVID pandemic, the government made a real effort to cooperate, work across party lines. And I'll give credit to Premier Ford and his House leader at the time, Paul Calandra. They reached out proactively. We had all party meetings. They asked for input from the opposition parties on emergency measures. Some of that input was listened to. I brought forward a number of ideas. For example, I was the one really pushing hard, saying like it's ridiculous to have sick notes when we're in the middle of a pandemic. Like, why
Yeah.
are we would be asking workers to have it? And so the Ford government listened and incorporated that into the legislation. And so, that level of collegiality and cooperation wouldn't have happened if the opposition wasn't willing to do that, but if the government hadn't reached out. And so the premier, to his credit, shortly after the election, he and I had a phone call. We've been texting back and forth since then, and have talked about measures related to pushing back against Trump and the tariff threat. And I think that's what people want us to do. I mean, this is an existential crisis to, our economy, our ability to fund a lot of the programs that people rely on each and every day from government. But at the same time, I think everybody who is at Queen's Park, whether you're in government or not, recognizes that for democracy to work, you need an opposition and you need an effective opposition. Because if the opposition's effective, it actually makes government better. And it ensures that people in Ontario, all people's voices are heard in the legislature. And so I take that role seriously. Sometimes you can be tough on each other in, let's say, question period or during debate and then go out into the hallway and have a conversation. And that happens a lot. Like I can't tell you how many. I remember one day I was going after the energy minister on some of their energy policies, which I disagree with from a climate and affordability perspective and he went back at me pretty hard. And then afterwards, we had a 30-minute conversation in the hallway just to talk through in a more substantive way energy policy. And we, found areas where we agreed, and then, clearly had areas where we disagreed. But I think we are both better parliamentarians because of the debate we had in the House and the conversation we had in the hallway.
I want to dig into policy in a minute. I want to talk about climate. I want to talk about healthcare. I want to talk about housing, and we've got to talk about Trump. But first, I got a bit of a question out of left field that comes from listening to this right now. Do you think that having cameras in the legislature has has changed the dynamic there for the better or for the worse? Does it encourage that kind of exchange that you the the more aggressive exchange, the more even theatrical exchange compared to what you get in the hallway?
Well, so I've never been in the legislature without cameras. I was first elected in 2018, so I don't know what the legislature is like pre-camera days. I mean, I did talk to some colleagues who said that it is less collegial since cameras have been introduced. On the other hand, I think it's important that people have an opportunity to watch debate. I mean, if you live in Thunder Bay, it's pretty hard to get down to Queen's Park and watch debate. I think one of the innovations that's come out of COVID that has been very valuable is when we do committee hearings now, people can testify via Zoom. So, people who live a long ways from Queen's Park can still participate in committee hearings. So I think that's important. I think those hallway conversations are really important too. And I think those conversations, from my understanding from talking to members who, predated video days, those conversations have always been important, whether there's cameras in the legislature or not. And one of the things I always tell my constituents is, you see me a lot in the media or you see me debating in the House, but some of the most important work I do, especially when it comes to advocacy work for my riding and for just constituents or organizations, happens in those hallway conversations when you can sit down and dig into some issues that are directly affecting people. And I think MPPs from all parties, if they're willing to engage in those kind of conversations, can make a real difference in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, is I once zoomed into a parliamentary committee from Seoul, South Korea, from the corner of an Airbnb, while my friend was sleeping opposite opposite the room. And it's true. It's accessible, right? It's made legislatures more accessible in all kinds of ways. But yeah, as you mentioned, there's trade-offs. Uh, let's dive into the Trump question now because we've got to talk about Donald Trump. We have because as you mentioned, it's an existential threat that the US poses. Premier Ford mentioned that Ontario could lose 500,000 jobs. The existence of the auto sector, which is so important to Ontario and critically to workers and their families and ancillary industries, that if we lose it, we're done for. What's your sense of what the province might do to approach dealing with Trump? Do you think that's the right way? And what would you add or subtract to that approach?
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with the premier that all tools should be on the table, and we need to prepare to retaliate and retaliate with strength. I was critical of the premier calling an election while we're facing this existential threat because I thought, why have a partisan election when we should really be working across party lines, showing strength through unity? But now that we're past the election, I'm going to continue to work across party lines to push back against Trump and to advocate for things that businesses and workers are telling me they need from government. I mean, first of all revenue from retaliatory tariffs should go back to workers in most affected industries. I mean, in Ontario, it's not just auto workers, which auto workers is huge, and I personally feel it in my riding. Guelph is the fourth most exposed city in the entire country. partly because the auto parts manufacturing is such a big part of our local economy. Also, all the major ag organizations are located here in Guelph, and agriculture is going to be deeply affected. But we also have a number of other manufacturing companies here in Guelph who, in one case, one company said 80% of their business is with the US. And so they're going to need financial support to just help them get through this, help them to protect their workers and to make sure people are not hurt too hard. And then we need to be looking at what can we do in a world where we can no longer trust the Americans. So that means diversifying our trading partners. It means doing things like this is what I've been critical on Ford is, my gosh, if there was ever a time to protect Ontario's farmland, now is the time when it comes to food security, food sovereignty, our $50 billion food and farming economy. So, the premier's agenda to pave over farmland, I think, was wrong prior to the Trump threat, but it's especially wrong with this kind of threat. We need to be looking at interprovincial trade barriers. We need to be looking at how do we build stronger, more resilient local supply chains. Um, Bringing in investment tax credits to support those businesses who want to invest in Ontario. I was talking to one business here in Guelph that was planning on building a new factory, creating hundreds of jobs, and that's on hold. And it was on hold prior to the tariffs actually being implemented. Just the threat of tariffs put that on hold. And so figuring out ways that we can unlock some of that investment in terms of job creation, I think is going to be critically important. But at the end of the day, I think the most important message we have to convey is that we're united, that we're going to have the backs of workers, and that people and families and communities are not going to suffer because of this, because we're all going to come together as Ontarians and support each other.
And the thing, I mean, the Trump tariffs are going to have a primary immediate effect of depressing trade, potentially driving us into a recession, job losses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That has a secondary effect as well of drying up provincial coffers.
Yep.
You collect less uh, revenue from people. People then need further support, and it exacerbates all our existing problems. And you've mentioned several of them already, and there's lots of them, right? Healthcare, housing, the environment, disability, uh, payments, the social welfare state more generally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm asking the following questions with that in mind, that it was a problem before, and now it's an even bigger problem. And I want to start with housing. During the election, you promised to get 250,000 affordable housing units built. And your proposal is looking like a bit like the federal proposals we're seeing now from the New Democrats and from the Liberals, and I assume probably similarly from the Greens, we're going to see, insofar as you wanted to partner with organizations to fund these buildings. Do you think you can convince the premier to take affordable housing seriously, to get provincial money into the hands of not for profit and non-market developers?
Yeah, David, it's going to be a tough sell because every time I've brought it up in the legislature, I'm accused of being a socialist. And
Well, that's not so bad.
and I oftentimes reply, "Oh, I didn't realize Bill Davis was a socialist."
Yes, right.
Like, back in the Bill Davis days, sometimes this would be across Canada, but 20,000 housing starts a year were nonprofit co-op social housing. And a big chunk of that was in Ontario. And so we've done this before, even under conservative governments. And the only way we're going to build deeply affordable homes is to actually have government assisted funding for nonprofit, co-op, supportive social housing. 93% of the deeply affordable homes built in the province of Ontario were built before 1995. So what happened in 1995? That was the when the federal government just, made significant cuts to housing programs, transfers to the provinces. The Harris government responded by cutting all the social housing programs and whole host of other things like, support payments for people with disabilities and Ontario Works and things like that. And so we've now had 30 years of not building deeply affordable housing. No wonder there is no place in Ontario, not a single city in Ontario, where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford average monthly rent. We have 81,000 people experiencing homelessness in Ontario right now. And I try to convey to the premier, Like this isn't just the human cost. And I mean, we should address this as for the human cost because everyone should have the human right to housing. But this significantly affects our economy. I can't tell you how many businesses I've talked to, especially small businesses, say that one of their biggest barriers is their workers cannot afford to live in the community they work in. I talked to businesses who have actually purchased housing and then are renting it to their employees because otherwise their employees couldn't afford to live in that community. So it's having significant, particularly in southwestern Ontario, it is a significant barrier to economic growth and employment for companies. And so, sometimes I feel like with this government, the human rights argument doesn't oftentimes win the day, but I'm hoping that maybe the economic argument can win the day.
It's the Saint Antoine de Exupéry's murdered Mozart is what I think of all the time is, this idea of seeing a poor child on a train or something like that and thinking that that child could have been the next Mozart,
Yep.
but for that poverty, right? I mean, this is such an old problem, but one that I think you've summarized really well is that people have this inherent right to these needs. They also have considerable potential that we're just burning in real time for want of a home or a livable wage or disability supports or whatever it might be. And well, I certainly hope they end up listening to that, as skeptical as I may be. But what when we're talking about affordable homes, sometimes we lose uh, in the mire the distinction between renters and owners. So I want to break that down for a minute. Is how much of your vision for housing in the province is about getting affordable rental? How much is it about affordable ownership, and what's the distinction there in terms of building?
It's both. And so I think one of the reasons a number of housing experts have said the Ontario Green Party has the best housing plan of any political party in the entire country is that we're looking at solutions along the entire continuum of housing. So, on the non-market side of things, our commitment to building 250,000 deeply affordable nonprofit co-op housing. But in addition to that, 60,000 permanent supportive housing with wraparound mental health, addictions, employment, and other supports and services, including 22,000 Indigenous-led permanent supportive housing, which would be critically important to addressing people who are experiencing homelessness because folks who are experiencing homelessness, some of those folks providing a roof over their head's not going to be the solution because their life isn't stabilized enough to maintain housing. So addressing the non-market side of things, but and a lot of that will primarily be rental housing. And we want to have good rental housing. Home ownership isn't for everyone. For some people, it could be lifestyle. For others, it could be maybe their job. Like, if you're only going to work somewhere for a year or two, it probably doesn't make sense to buy a house unless you're going to stay there long term. But we also want to make sure that home ownership's available to folks. And we have a whole generation of young folks in particular who the dream of home ownership is really becoming further and further away for them to realize. I mean, I have a 25-year-old daughter living in our basement. Would love to be able to own a home someday, and is thinking, my gosh, I never will, like and a ton of people in her generation are experiencing that. And that's one of the reasons we're pushing for changing zoning rules to make it legal to build fourplexes and four-story as of right in all neighborhoods in Ontario so we can quickly increase housing supply in communities that people know and love, close to where they work, so they don't have to pave over farmland and wetlands and the green belt, where we already have infrastructure built. So that's the fastest and cheapest way to increase housing supply. We're also working hard to legalize 6 to 11 story buildings, which could be ownership condominiums or could be rental units along major transit and transportation corridors in mid to large size cities. Again, so we can quickly ramp up supply where we already have infrastructure in place. And so those are the kinds of market solutions we need as well. And then we're also talking about lowering fees and taxes on starter homes. So homes under 1,800 square feet within existing urban boundaries. So again, that can save up to $140,000 on the cost of a new home for a starter home, and then obviously needing to have the provincial government replace that funding so municipalities are remain whole and have the funding they need to build the infrastructure to support communities and housing. But it's those kinds of bold solutions that we're going to need. But in addition to that, David, we're going to need stronger protections for renters, rent control, regulations around rent evictions, regulations about above guideline rent increases and things like this, because we have to make sure that when we build rental housing, that it is affordable and remains affordable for people. And then finally, one thing that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is driving speculation out of the housing market. Homes should be for people, not speculators. So bringing in policies like anti-flipping taxes, vacant homes taxes, a multiple home speculation tax, which is probably the most controversial that we brought in. But even Bill Davis did that back in the day when housing prices were getting out of control. And, you started seeing, what we're seeing now, large corporations in bidding wars with young families and buying up housing stock and making it unaffordable for first-time home buyers to be able to own a home. So I think what separates our policies from other parties is it's very comprehensive. It looks at market and non-market solutions, and it addresses the full continuum of housing needs because we have to get past this false choice that it's either tall or sprawl. There's
Mhm.
all kinds of housing choices in between that I think we need to make available for people and families.
I've lived in all of them. I represent the continuum of apartment buildings and detached and semi-detached and rent and own. I've been through all of it, and let me tell you, I now represent, by the way, full disclosure, the problem end of ownership, the sprawly paved over wetlands in the green belt, strictly speaking, but not the protected controversial bit of the green belt, the one that was developed decades ago or sold off decades ago. But but it does speak to the broader problem. And I'm glad you mentioned the distinction between needs because I never thought about owning for the longest time. In fact, didn't want to own. And I didn't own until I was 40, 40, even 41 years old. It was just recently because it didn't fit. But we were pushed out because we needed a bigger home and we couldn't do it where we were. We had to push out, right? And that's another that challenge people are facing. But I think that's the distinction is really, really important and often lost. So I'm really glad to see that you're pushing it. On healthcare, I, I'm a little bit exasperated because you propose a number of solutions I thought were entirely sensible, including this one. Recruiting 3,500 more doctors through medical school and residency opportunities. To me, that sounds great. I love it. I'm all for it. This includes international graduates. Ditto,
Yep.
all for it. But to me, this seems like such a table stakes obvious solution that I'm thinking, like, why haven't we done this already? And I say that incredulously, but I mean, you weren't the one in power. This is on you. This is on the Tories, but also the liberals
Yep.
prior to them. Like, why haven't we done this already?
Because it costs money.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say
That's
that.
always good. That's what it
So,
gets you every
so
time.
I can give you lots of healthcare solutions, but here's the foundation of the problem, at least in Ontario. So Ontario has the lowest per capita funding for healthcare of any province in the country. And it would take an additional $12 billion investment just to get us up to the national average. Well, imagine what you could do with $12 billion. How many doctors, how many nurses, how many PSWs could you hire? Like how, like all the hospitals, especially in rural communities, are struggling to keep their emergency departments open. You could fix that. Like the fact that 2.5 million and likely growing to 5 million Ontarians don't have access to a primary care provider. Well, think of how many doctors and nurse practitioners we could hire to provide people with primary health care, home and community care. I mean, one of the challenges hospitals face is that they're seeing higher levels of acuity for people who come in because they don't have access to a family doctor. And then on the other side, they're finding it challenging to, discharge people from hospital who are ready to go home, but need a little bit of home care. And they can't access the home care. So the whole system needs money. And money is not the only solution. Like there are many things we can do. I'm going to give you one example with family doctors. There are many things we can do that are not financial related, but all of that's window dressing if we don't actually have the financial resources to invest in the system. So one example on family doctors is, I was just speaking a couple months ago with family medicine students for McMaster, and I asked them, how many of them were actually going to go into practicing family medicine, and only about 20%. And primarily, I asked them, well, why? You're studying family medicine. Why aren't you going to? And most of it was administrative burden and paperwork. They're
Hmm.
like you just have so much paperwork, so much administrative burden, and some of it's so ridiculous. They're like going, we're still faxing prescriptions to
I
people,
know.
or faxing, like we're calling, in some cases, we're making like 7, 8 phone calls to access a specialist for a patient. And it's like, we don't want to do that work. We're going to medical school to like care for people, not to do paperwork. And so there are non-monetary solutions we can do to take administrative burden off of people and things like that, to have a more integrated system, bringing different healthcare sectors together within our communities to break down silos and work more efficiently and effectively. All of that we need to do. I mean, all of us want to have a more efficient, cost-effective system, but none of that is going to replace the fact that we grossly underfund public healthcare in Ontario. And I want to be very clear, the Ford government's privatization agenda is only going to make that worse. We've seen it with agency nurses, which are costing hospitals and long-term care far more money than if they had the resources to just hire full-time staff. And we've seen in provinces like British Columbia that went down the privatization road more than Ontario, they're backtracking on that because they're
Hmm.
paying more and getting less.
Let me ask you about this privatization scheme because when it came out, I guess a couple of years ago now, I remember feeling like I was missing something. And I pay pretty close attention to politics and policy, and I talked to some experts, and I kept feeling like I was missing something. So this plan comes out, and Ford says we're going to go private clinics for, hip replacements, cataract surgeries, things you can focus on and become more efficient at. And I'm thinking, okay, well, so far so good on the focus and the efficiency argument. I think that makes a lot of sense. But why not make them public community centers? Like, why do they have to be private? And I kept thinking, well, because they have an ideological predilection, this is the best case scenario, towards private. But but to me, we could have done the same efficiency argument, the same investment argument, the same specialization argument, but done it not for profit or public, right? Am I missing something there?
100%. I'll give you a great example. It's happening right in my riding. So, Guelph General Hospital is partnering with Conestoga College to have an offsite to move a lot of their diagnostic and even some out of the hospital and into community. And they're going to do it at Conestoga's campus. And that's going to enable Conestoga students to have hands-on learning experiences with staff from Guelph General Hospital. And the argument I've heard from Guelph General is like, this is perfect. We're going to free up space in the hospital itself. So because our hospital is way over capacity in Guelph, they run over 100% capacity each and every day. So the more room we can free up in the hospital, but because it's connected to the hospital, nonprofit, it doesn't mean the hospital is going to lose staff because all the staff are connected to the hospital. So they're not going to be competing with a private for-profit operation for staff, which is a huge challenge with what the Ford government's proposing. And we have the added benefit that we're going to provide educational opportunities for the next generation of healthcare workers. Why can't we do that in communities across
Yeah.
Ontario? It would be cheaper, be more effective, and it wouldn't additionally contribute to the health human resource shortage that we're seeing in the public sector right now.
The cheaper thing gets me too, because I kept saying, I'm like, look, I'm not a huge math guy. I remember dropping math in high school and going to the guidance counselor's office because you need a permission to drop math. On the, by the way, advice of the math teacher, he's basically like, you shouldn't be here. What I did was I specialized in the humanities. Uh, and I remember sitting in the guidance counselor's office and looking up at the wall, and there was a poster that said, dropping math, say goodbye to 82 job opportunities. I was like, oh no, I made out okay. But that's all by way of saying, uh, I can do logic though. And I'm looking at the Ford plan thinking, well, these private folks expect to make a profit. They're going to make a profit off somebody.
Yep.
Somebody's going to pay for that. Either they're going to bill extra or they're going to rush through these procedures to try to maximize that profit. Like we're missing something. To me, the added value proposition of the community clinics is that you get better care. You don't get pushed into things you don't need, and you don't get folks rushing through to try to maximize profit. So that's all by way of asking. In the for-profit model, where do you think they're going to extract that maximized profit? Who's going to ultimately pay for that and how?
Well, I think taxpayers are going to pay for it, and I think patients are going to pay for it. So taxpayers are going to pay for it because we're likely going to pay more for the services that are being delivered, and patients are going to pay for it because they face intense pressure to upsell, things like cataract surgery to encourage or push people to, take on certain surgical procedures that they don't necessarily need. And I can't tell you how many complaints that have come into my constituency office, and I'm assuming MPPs from all parties and all communities are receiving these kinds of complaints, where people have said, especially seniors, are feeling pressured to consent to procedures they don't necessarily need and are having to pay out of pocket for them. And so I think it's going to be both taxpayers and patients. And then finally is if you're going to rush through things and treat patients like they're on a factory line, they're likely going to receive lower levels of care.
Yeah, and there's some data on this. I mean, I've read about this in the United Kingdom. There was a study that said, you get worse care and death rates are higher in
Yep, I've seen that
for-profit
too.
hospitals, right? Like, and which stands to reason if you could do the basic math of it, the basic logic of it, is, of course, because they're doing exactly what you say. It's a factory floor, it's an assembly line. You treat people like they're car parts. Uh, I want to close out on climate because given the number of challenges we face, the affordability crisis, the Trump tariff crisis, it feels to me like climate is being lost in our discussions of public policy of what to do. That we're ready to throw climate under the bus and do long-term damage to ourselves and end up paying more for all these things when the worst of it starts to arrive, which is already beginning. Do you feel like climate is being lost in the current policy discussion?
Well, I think in the provincial leaders debate, would we have 15 seconds each to
Yeah,
discuss climate?
that
I was
drove
going to
me
say for
bananas.
15 seconds, I think I got a lot in,
Yeah, you did.
but it was hard. It was hard. And so I think that tells you all you need to know. And, one of the things I said during the campaign a lot, David, and it's related to our previous discussion on healthcare. I think the climate crisis is the existential crisis of our generation. But I think we have a deeper crisis, and it's a crisis of caring. And if we're not going to care for each other, how are we going to care for the planet? And if we're not going to care for the planet, how are we going to care for each other? And I think the underinvesting in our systems of care, the growing just extreme levels of inequality in our society is making it more difficult to address climate because to address climate takes a level of social solidarity that we don't have right now. And so, one of the things I've been trying to do is to talk about how do we build community? How do we build connections? How do we build more caring in our society? Because I think that's going to be foundational to addressing climate. So, when I talk about housing, like our housing strategy is a climate strategy. If you're going to make homes more affordable for people, that's going to increase economic security, reduce anxiety, free up time for social solidarity. Also, it means you don't have long, expensive commutes, which is the biggest driver of climate pollution in Ontario is transportation emissions. When I talk about affordability, it's like we're at a point now where if you own an electric vehicle and an electric heat pump, on average, you'll save between $500 and $777 a month. So why don't we make these available for people? Like we
Yeah.
have an affordability crisis. We can address the affordability crisis, saving people money every month and reduce climate pollution at the same time. But we're going to need government policy to make it affordable for folks. electric car rebates, zero interest loans for heat pumps. So let's do what PEI New Brunswick have done. Any household under $100,000 gets a free heat pump. So there are things we can do to address climate that save people money, are going to create jobs, are good for our economy, actually make us more resilient to the Trump tariff threats. But we're going to need a government and a population that's going to support government action. And then you're going to have to ask me, well, how are you going to pay for all this? Because I get asked that all the time. And so one of the ways we're going to have to do that, which I think also addresses this social solidarity issue, is we need to have more fairness in our tax system. That's why our platform was called Fighting for Fairness. We were the only party who said, you know what, we have to bring in a wealth tax for people who, earn over 10 million or who have wealth of over $10 million. And we also called for raising the top tax bracket for anyone earning over $250,000 to generate additional revenue. One, to help lower taxes on the lowest income people in a way that doesn't go up the scale. So actually the wealthiest benefit the most. So we did it in a way that was very targeted to low income workers, but also to be able to generate the kind of revenue we need to make life more affordable for people so we can invest in housing affordability, so we can shore up healthcare and education, so we can actually make investments in climate. And so those are conversations that a lot of politicians are not willing to have. I talked about it a lot. I got the most votes of any MPP in the entire province. So maybe that says something about Guelph, but maybe it also says something that people are hungry for honest conversations that are grounded in practical solutions that are going to improve people's lives. And having the courage to have those conversations with people, I think, are critically important. And it's one of the reasons I like a format like podcasting because it allows us to get a little in depth. It's hard to talk about that in a 10-second, sound bite on TV or the radio. And so I think we need more places and spaces in our society to have more in-depth conversations around how do we address this crisis of caring, which I think is critically important to addressing the climate crisis.
We're just in our last couple of minutes, but you have reminded me that I need to call my HVAC folks about a heat pump. We're just, we're
Okay,
in
so
it.
so people say heat pumps don't work in cold weather. We just went through one of the coldest Februaries we've had in maybe a decade. My heat pump kept the house warm the whole month, and I saved money.
You
So
save
it's
money.
like, wow, it worked, and I saved money, and there is no gas in my house right now at all. So you
Yeah.
know what? It's like win, win, win. And the company that installed it hired some good tradespeople, and
Yes.
I was happy to pay them to come in and, help me save money and save the climate at the same time.
This is the way. We're a newer build, so our system is fairly new, but there's incentive programs, there's discounts, there's all kinds of things. And as you mentioned, it pays for itself. The challenge is you also suggested when you were talking about New Brunswick and PEI was that for some folks it's too expensive to make the investment, right? This is the classic thing: is if you're wealthy, you can make investments that save you money. If you're poor, you can't because you can't front the capital to do that. So we do need that.
100%.
Yeah.
So I took advantage of the loan program.
Hmm.
So, my payback is $300 a month, but I'm saving more than $300.
Right.
But I had to have the money to be able to pay for everything and then get the loan. And so that's
Hmm.
why I think we really need to have some things like free heat pump programs for households under 100,000. We could design these programs where people get the loan up front so they don't need the capital. So right now, most of these programs I always like to say are, written by rich people for rich people, and we need
Hmm.
some programs that are written are designed in a way that ensures that people, working and lower income Canadians, Ontarians can benefit from them as well.
I'll close out on this question, a related question about greening the electricity grid. Uh, how do we do that? You've been talking about closing down gas plants over time. You mentioned that you would at least maintain generation at Bruce and Darlington for nuclear generation. Beyond that, what does a cleaner grid look like, and how does that proceed?
So, David, one of the other challenges to addressing the climate crisis is the disproportionate power that the oil and gas giants have in our politics, our public discourse. I can't tell you how many meetings I go to where I'm there to give a big speech and it's sponsored by Enbridge Gas, as an example.
Hmm.
And so I preface it by saying that I always thought when the price of wind and solar, so renewable and water power, I would say, the water power has always been pretty low. So let's stick with wind, solar, and storage. When the price came down, it would just be a no-brainer that we would address climate. So here we are in a situation where solar power is the cheapest source of electricity generation in the world now. That's why $600 billion were invested in solar last year alone, because countries around the world recognize this is the lowest cost way to generate electricity. And yet in Ontario, we're like completely missing in action and we're ramping up gas plants, which are far more expensive and then obviously contribute significantly to climate pollution. I mean, Ontario's grid has become 10% dirtier since Ford was elected in 2018 than it is today. So I'm just like, I thought that when solar and wind, when the prices came down, it would be a no-brainer, and yet we're still not doing it. And so that's one of the reasons now I'm just calling for, and this is something I think conservatives should support. Why don't we have a public procurement process where we put out bids for the lowest cost, emission-free electricity, and then we could put wind and solar. They don't even need subsidies at this point. I mean, they could use subsidies to help people like myself put solar panels on my roof. But when it comes to utility scale wind and solar, like they're totally cost competitive, especially when it comes to gas generation. And yet, for whatever reason, the Ford government is ramping up gas plants. It makes absolutely no sense economically. I think the only reason it makes sense is that, they're ideologically committed to the oil and gas sector, and the oil and gas lobby is incredibly powerful in Ontario, and we're just going to need people power to push back against it.
Very quickly on the power question, you mentioned storage. I mean, like the cost of everything has come down, but also like battery technology has improved quite a bit recently, right? And the battery costs have just plummeted. I saw a graph
100%.
recently of it's wild how fast that has come down. They just reached the tipping point and then down it went, right?
Yeah, 100%. And then some people say, well, what are you going to do with all these batteries? Well, we already have companies now that will mine the batteries when they can't be used anymore. So we actually create a full circular economy when it comes to the critical minerals you see in batteries. And so like to me, it's such a no-brainer, but the oil and gas lobby is incredibly powerful, and especially in a country like Canada. And it's really holding us back. I mean, I just look at, like even countries like China, and certainly don't want us to be like China in any way. I'm not suggesting that, but they're deploying like the levels of solar and wind, especially solar, they're deploying are off the charts. I just read an article today, like half the vehicles sold in China now are EVs. Like they're quickly leapfrogging us and becoming ahead of us when it comes to deploying green technologies. And this gets back to the whole Trump tariff threat thing. Hey, if we're going to be competitive in a 21st century economy, boy, shouldn't we be investing in the energy sources of the future where costs are going down dramatically? And instead, for whatever reason, the Ford government is, continuing to ramp up old, expensive, dirty technology. It makes absolutely no sense to me.
Well, we could spend episodes and episodes and episodes on all the things that make no sense that we're doing, but we've come to time, alas. But it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I think people will have really enjoyed this nice, substantive conversation, and I appreciate so much that you've joined me today. Thank you.
Hey, my pleasure, David. Big fan of your work. So happy to come and chat anytime.
Oh, well, now I like you even more. So that's very, very nice. Thank you very much. And as always, to those listening, thank you so much, and we'll see you back here next time.